When this asylum first opened in the 1800s, it was supposed to be a place of hope for Welsh-speaking patients with mental illnesses. But within decades, it became overcrowded, understaffed, and notorious for the so-called treatments that it offered. Over the almost 150 years that Denbigh Asylum was open, thousands of patients died here. But some believe that not all of them truly left. Even to this day, security teams and urban explorers claim that the ruins of the old mental hospital aren't as empty as they seem, with reports of shadow figures, phantom footsteps, and disembodied voices captured whispering in Welsh as if the patients are still locked away here. But what truly went on behind the doors of this crumbling Victorian mental hospital? And could it explain why people still see the Grey Lady staring at them from the shattered windows today? First of all, can we just take a moment for this building? She is stunning, even if she is falling apart. Relatable. But just looking at the grand Victorian main building, your mind is already conjuring up images of poltergeists and ghostly faces watching you from the shadows. But obviously, back when it first started welcoming patients in, that wasn't the case at all. Because when it first opened, just outside the town of Denbigh in the autumn of 1848 as the North Wales County's lunatic asylum, it was seen as a place where you could receive the compassion and the restorative care that you needed to support you with what you were going through. Hold on a second, Claire, what do you mean we're not going to get into horror stories of brutal patient treatments and deaths? I know, but that's the thing. Initially, that just wasn't how it was. It was built to house up to 200 Welsh-speaking patients, so they wouldn't have to be shipped off to English-speaking asylums, which isn't going to be the best environment for you when you can't even speak the same language as the attendants who are supposed to be providing you care. So on paper, initially, it's all a great idea. It housed people with mental illnesses, dementia patients, people with learning difficulties, and even people who had epilepsy. But obviously, the parameters for what defines someone who needs to be committed has changed massively since the mid-19th century. So there were cases of people being sent to Denbigh under the pretense of a quote-unquote moral defect, sometimes just for having a child out of wedlock. And also, because admission only required 2 doctors' signatures, it was frighteningly easy for families to use the asylum as a way to hide away anyone considered an embarrassment or simply inconvenient, which is pretty scary to think about. But whether you needed to be there or not, if you found yourself at the asylum in those days, they effectively didn't really have anything to treat you with. And so one of the prescriptions given out to patients was employment. Not like an actual paying job though, you were just made to work. Because Denbigh was basically its own little ecosystem. It was entirely self-sufficient, with male patients either working a skilled job like being a joiner, shoemaker, butcher, or they'd be working on the farms helping with the crops, or even the herds of pigs and cattle that were all raised to provide food. Women were given domestic duties, working in the asylum's laundry, doing the cleaning, or knitting and sewing. Basically, skilled or not, if you were well enough to work, that's what you would be occupying your time with. But another prescription was recreation, so, you know, it wasn't all work. No risk of making Jack a dull boy over here. Patients would be encouraged to take walks in the Denbigh countryside or play games like bowls or skittles. And they did actually introduce weekly dances in 1864 too, because they did have a proper ballroom in the building. And obviously this was a great thing for patients, they really enjoyed it, but it also served as a useful tool for attendants. They could observe the patients to see if perhaps they might be ready to go back out into the big wide world, or maybe not. Better up your dose and send you on a few more country walks this week. And so the picture that I'm trying to paint here, to give you the real view of what Denbigh was like, at least in those very early days, was not of this American Horror Story style asylum. Denbigh was actually the 4th asylum in Britain to install a Turkish bath, so it was right at the forefront of psychiatry at the time, with Dr. Jones, the medical superintendent who was overseeing the place, writing that there was a marked improvement with several patients who had been experiencing acute mania. But in terms of actual treatments, things were still very limited for quite some time. In fact, Denbigh's bill for wine, spirits and porter was actually higher than its bill for medicine for decades. But as the years went on, the medicines that they did have access to and increasingly leaned on might have made patients seem quote-unquote better, but not in a good way. Doctors started to rely heavily on sedation, with chloral hydrate being the go-to drug. It would quiet patients, but it was addictive and dangerous in its own right. Patients diagnosed with hysteria or the late-stage effects of syphilis, what was then called general paralysis of the insane, they were often prescribed mercury, something that is obviously incredibly dangerous and would slowly poison you, causing tremors, memory loss, and even psychosis. In other words, it would make your mental state far worse before killing you. Patients were also prescribed bromides, a chemical that today is used in flame retardants, but back then was given to keep patients docile and less likely to lash out at attendants. And these medications, they weren't unique to Denbigh. Every asylum in Britain was using them at the time. But one problem that really started to spiral at Denbigh was overcrowding. By the 1860s, the building was already being extended to try and cope with the demand. They even built a new separate chapel on the grounds so that they could reclaim a few rooms from the main building. But it wasn't nearly enough, and the cracks were beginning to show. In his 1874 report, the superintendent at the time, Dr. Powell, complained that more and more of the patients being admitted were either elderly, frail, or suffering from conditions that were never going to improve. And what that meant was they weren't going to get better, just continue to take up more beds. And the reason was that the government had made it cheaper for poor law unions to send these people to the asylum rather than to keep them in the workhouse. And so the asylum was becoming more and more like this dumping ground, rather than a facility where people with mental illnesses could be supported. By 1878, the numbers at Denbigh had skyrocketed, with long-term patients piling up year after year, just more and more of them being admitted and not that many being discharged. Beds had to be shoved up into every spare corner, lined up so close that the patients had to climb in and out from the foot of the bed. Some had to sleep in corridors, while others were apparently straight up sleeping on the floor. Just patients everywhere, bursting at the seams, and not even close to enough attendants to provide proper care for them all. Fast forward a few decades into the early 20th century, and the so-called treatments being prescribed to these patients weren't getting much kinder either. To be clear though, still not unique to Denbigh. Every asylum was rolling out the same stuff at the time, but that doesn't make it any less grim. Like insulin shock therapy, which was used as a treatment for schizophrenia. Doctors would deliberately administer doses of insulin to put patients into a hypoglycemic coma, where they would then be brought around with glucose. And this process was repeated daily for months at a time because they believed that these comas effectively reset the brain, all because patients appeared to be a little calmer when they came around from the comas. Yeah, I wonder why. You've just messed with their blood sugar levels and put them into a coma. But in reality, it didn't help, and if they misjudged your doses, you wouldn't wake up. Electroconvulsive therapy was another one that was introduced in the 1930s, where an electrical current is passed through the brain to cause a controlled seizure. While ECT is still used today, in those early years, it was administered straight. No anaesthetic and no muscle relaxant, which meant that sometimes people dislocated joints or even broke bones from the convulsions. But then there was also the miracle cure of the 1940s, the prefrontal leucotomy, also known as a lobotomy, where connections are severed in the patient's prefrontal cortex. And if all of that wasn't enough, they also tried deep sleep therapy, which on the face of it sounds like a picnic, but it was where patients were knocked out with heavy sedatives like barbitone sodium for up to 2 weeks straight, basically trying to sleep the mania out of them. And these treatments, they might have been the standard for the time, but it doesn't make them any less brutal for the patients who had to suffer through them. I couldn't even imagine what it would have been like being a patient in the early half of the 20th century. And unfortunately, on top of that, there were still bad seeds among the Denbigh staff who went beyond neglect and outright abused people in their care. The records show that some staff were caught and dismissed for physically abusing them. It's just, even in a system that was already full of suffering in the name of curing mental illness, there were still people making it worse. Like, I know the treatments at the time, they were thought to be doing good for the patient, but you could still see that the patients are in pain and they're suffering. So to then make it worse on top of that, it's just a whole other level, isn't it? 100 years after opening though, the place was becoming infamous. I saw some comments where people from the local area said it's how you would scare the kids. So like, don't misbehave or you'll end up at Denbigh. And being operational for that amount of time, you can just imagine the sheer amount of lives that ended within those walls. What started out as a place of hope for restorative treatment, where you'd be able to recover and get discharged, turned into basically just this dumping ground for the parish. Because alongside the long-term patients who had no hope of being discharged from the asylum, the parish would also send the poor who were at the end of their lives. One superintendent actually begged for them to stop doing this, saying that some of these people only lived for a few weeks or days after their admission, most of them never even leaving their bed in that time. And so the death toll was in the thousands at Denbigh. There are official records that actually show that between 1848 and 1946, 6,373 patients died in the asylum. If you were over 60 years old, chances are you were going to die here, which is even more so the case if you were in your 70s. If you were suffering from general paralysis of the insane, that late-stage syphilis, it was pretty much a done deal. You weren't getting out of Denbigh alive. A lot of deaths were because of natural causes, heart conditions, strokes and cancers, but because of how overcrowded the asylum quickly became, infectious diseases obviously ran rampant, with loads of patients dying from typhoid, dysentery, tuberculosis and influenza. Although sometimes patients did die from the drugs and the treatments that they were prescribed. There was one report of a woman with epilepsy who passed away from burns that she sustained in the Turkish bath while she was having an epileptic fit, which is just absolutely unthinkable. What a horrific, terrifying, painful way to go. And while you'd think that patients who passed away at Denbigh would be buried on the grounds in a dedicated churchyard by the chapel, they actually weren't. A few times they did push to try and get a graveyard, but it was never approved. And so patients who weren't claimed by families for a private funeral were buried in Denbigh Cemetery. There aren't any headstones for them though, no names of who is buried where, just a single memorial stone to say they are buried in this area, still in view of the asylum. They also buried the dead in the churchyard of St Marcella's on the other side of town too. But for the living at Denbigh in the 20th century, it was still as busy as ever, in fact even more so. During World War I, the asylum came under huge strain as patients from other mental hospitals like Cardiff were transferred here, so that beds could be freed up to care for soldiers who had been injured in the war. But then also shell-shocked soldiers suffering from PTSD, many of them became long-term residents at Denbigh. Literally 40 years later, there were still about 50 of those soldiers there. In 1948, Denbigh was brought under the control of the National Health Service, and it became the North Wales Hospital for Nervous and Mental Disorders, referred to as North Wales Mental Hospital. And during this time, patient numbers continued to swell, so it was extended yet again to accommodate more beds. But by 1956, overcrowding had reached its peak, with over 1,500 patients within its walls. But the answer to overcrowding wasn't going to come from just forever extending the building and hoping for the best. It would actually be in the advancements made to psychiatric treatments. Because in the later half of the 50s into the 1960s, medications were playing a larger and larger part in treatment. And not just the kind of chemicals that would subdue you and make you easier to handle. More and more people were being put on medication that meant they could be discharged entirely. And so slowly, patient numbers weren't quite so critical. The writing was on the wall though after the Minister of Health, Enoch Powell, visited in 1960 and soon announced plans to phase out the old Victorian asylums. By 1987, new local services were being built up in the area, and in 1995, the last patient left Denbigh for good, 147 years after it first opened. And that was that, literally. No plan, no care, no preservation of this absolutely gorgeous building. It was just, your job is done, we're done with you. I think the site was taken over by an initial development company, obviously with plans to turn it into something or other, but they never did anything at all to the place. And what happens when you leave a Victorian complex like this to the weather, especially in North Wales? That's right, it crumbles. Walls have fallen down and floors have rotted just completely away. After that development company did literally nothing to preserve this now derelict Grade 2 listed building, the council had to step in. In 2013, they slapped down a compulsory purchase order, and in 2018, they finally took full ownership. They have now come to an agreement with a different development company, and plans are underway to redevelop the site into new homes. They do have to keep the main building, as that's the listed part, but yeah, living on the site of an old mental hospital. As of right now, 2025, the site is very much off limits. It is heavily patrolled, lots of security. Not that that's stopped urban explorers from having a nose about the place, of course. And I think because of that, rumours of this place being evil and all of this have started to come out. But before I move on and talk about anything else, I think it is important to stop and look at Denbigh for what it really was. It wasn't some horror movie asylum where millions are murdered and it's now haunted by demons. It was a hospital. Yes, patients did suffer and die here. Sometimes because of brutal treatments or even mistreatment by staff. And overall, it was just not a place that you wanted to find yourself. But as psychiatry evolved, more and more people received the treatment that they needed to be discharged and go on to live their lives. And there are so many people who both were admitted here and who worked here who look back on their time at Denbigh fondly. It was a huge part of the community. Lots of local people were employed there or knew someone who received treatment there. And I do think that that is why Denbigh brings up conflicting feelings in people. Some see it as a place that provided a vital service and it should be preserved, but others can't look past the dark history and the suffering that patients went through here and feel the entire thing should be torn down. However you feel about the North Wales Mental Hospital though, this place still very much has that presence in memory and in community, and obviously in the crumbling ruins that continue to draw people back inside now. Plenty of people head there to explore the ruins out of historical curiosity, to see the scale of the place, because it is absolutely massive, or just to see how far it has fallen into disrepair, because it is bad. But others are drawn in by something else entirely. Of course, the paranormal. Before 2008, this doesn't seem to have been a huge thing for Denbigh. But then, for their Halloween event, Most Haunted did a live special here, which was broadcast over 7 nights. And the whole thing lives on YouTube. It's what you'd expect from Most Haunted. But it did not go down well with the locals, because the whole spectacle was branded as the Village of the Damned. But they also, as part of their night vision camera bit of the show, strapped themselves into straitjackets inside padded cells. Now look, I get the use of using trigger objects in paranormal investigations, putting relevant objects or equipment back in the place where it would have been used and see if you get a response, but strapping yourself into a straitjacket, I don't know, that just seems quite insensitive considering there are still people around today who were treated for mental illness there. But then they threw in this whole storyline about witches. They said that the land that the asylum was built on was cursed because witches had been executed in the area. The reality was that there was one record of a woman hanged for witchcraft in Denbigh Town Square in 1594, who was actually the first woman in Wales tried and executed for it. But that's it. No mention of witches tied to the asylum itself until Most Haunted decided to make it part of the show. I don't know, it just feels like a stretch, as if the real history wasn't dramatic enough for their Halloween episode. Which in my humble opinion, that counts for absolutely nothing. I think the history was. It is so fascinating. So yeah, that happened. A lot of locals wish it never had happened, because then also, I don't think it's a coincidence that less than a month after the live broadcast aired, in November 2008, Denbigh suffered a major arson attack that completely destroyed the ballroom. More deliberate fires followed, with 2 in 2017 and another in 2018, leaving some parts of the hospital so badly damaged that developers had no choice but to demolish them. They were too far gone to repair. But the state of the place now, it is just shocking. I watched a lot of urbexing videos, obviously doing the research for this one, and it just blows my mind how Denbigh, and I mean other abandoned sites in general, how they get treated. But anyway, naturally, when people aren't sneaking into Denbigh to set it on fire, a lot of people now go looking for ghosts. Because now the old mental hospital has this reputation of being one of the most haunted buildings in Wales, which is interesting considering, like I said, not really much talk about it pre-Most Haunted. But anyway, a lot of people visiting the site have claimed to experience something weird while they're exploring. But there's one guy, Peter Glynn, and he has some very interesting stories from from before the hospital even closed, because Peter worked at Denbigh doing his nurse training there and then went on to work nights for 13 years at the hospital. And he actually wrote a short book on all of the experiences that he supposedly had at the North Wales Mental Hospital while he was working there. And some of them are absolutely terrifying. One night in 1975, he and a group of other nurses were on some downtime and they were joking about when they decided that they were going to prank one of the trainee nurses. One of them hid in the cupboard, and when the trainee came into the room, they made this big song and dance about this mysterious knocking sound that they kept hearing. They went on to say that every time they tried to leave the room, they'd hear this knocking. They gave her a demonstration, and as if on cue, this knocking started coming from the cupboard. Absolutely frightened this poor girl to death, but she eventually figured it out that it was one of the nurses hiding in a cupboard knocking. Oh, haha, very funny, thanks for that. As they all went to leave the room though, they heard an actual knocking sound coming from the now completely empty cupboard. The knocking got louder and louder before just fading away. But later that night, from his room above where they had been, Peter claimed that he could still hear those same knocking sounds coming from the empty cupboard in the room below him. Other nights though, it wasn't knocking that he experienced, but something a lot weirder. While he was sat alone on the ward one night, he heard from behind him the rattle of keys and the sound of a door unlocking, followed by heavy footsteps, as if someone was walking through onto the ward. And he thought that that was very weird, as he heard it coming from right behind him, so he turned around to look, but there was nothing to see, as he expected, because there was no door behind him, only a solid wall. But he knew what he had heard, so he asked another nurse about it later on. Telling a story like that, I hear a sound coming from behind me, and what do you know? It's Ernie. They told him that, yeah, that happens quite a lot, because in that exact spot used to be a walkway with a door, and what he was hearing was the ghostly echo of the ward sister still doing her nightly rounds long after she'd passed away, and the door had been sealed up as the layout to the hospital changed over time. And sometimes it wasn't just sounds. In 1981, Peter and a colleague were at the nurse's station in the early hours of the morning when they noticed one of their patients get up from his bed and walk towards the veranda. What was very strange was that this patient in particular was an older man who was unfortunately dying of cancer and barely mobile. Immediately, they rushed to go and get him back to bed and check he was okay, but when they got to the door to the veranda, it was still locked, and it could only be locked from the inside. Once they got out there though, to where they had most definitely seen this patient so clearly that they both knew exactly who he was, they were utterly shocked. There was no one out there, nowhere that he could have gone either. Okay. They both just thought, all right, let's go and actually check on this patient, make sure everything's fine. And so they went to his bedroom and lifted the covers off him, and they found him laying in bed, and he'd already passed away. Oh, that one gave me chills. I do love a good story of a crisis apparition though. They are so fascinating. But then there are some incidents that Peter described in his book that are utterly terrifying. One night he was struck with what's called night nurse paralysis, and it's basically sleep paralysis. Your eyes are open, you're looking around the room, but you can't move. And Peter, he couldn't scream for help when he noticed a figure floating down the corridor towards him. She was an older woman with long grey hair wrapped in a shroud, and she had stockings that had rolled down her legs, but her face was twisted into a horrifying scream. When Peter was finally able to break from the paralysis, he hurled a pillow at her and the figure vanished. Well, that was that then. Scary stuff, but just the human body doing weird things, right? Only a few hours later, a deceased patient was wheeled past him on a trolley. When the sheet covering the patient slipped, he was paralysed with fear all over again, because this patient who had passed away in the night, was the same woman he had seen gliding towards him. No, what do you mean I don't even need to be asleep to experience sleep paralysis? I'm just gonna go ahead and opt out of that right now. No, thank you at all. But with Peter's stories, could you write them all off as tricks of the mind? Exhaustion during night shifts or whatever? Maybe. But those details, if it really did go down the way he said it did, they're very weird, ranging all the way to absolutely petrifying. It would would be really interesting though if more staff members came forward with any stories of weirdness that they experienced, if any, during their time at Denbigh. Maybe could corroborate any of the experiences that Peter had, or if you had your own, I would love to hear all about them as well. As for actual ghosts said to haunt the old mental hospital, this one is a bit unique in that there aren't really specific named characters that I can introduce you to. These are more just legends, rumours, shared through word of mouth more than anything. But the first one is the ghost of a so-called caretaker who allegedly was captured in this grainy photo taken in 2017. It seems to be more of a reflection of torchlight on whatever uneven surface is right at the end of the corridor, but I see it kind of looks a little bit humanoid in shape. But the woman who captured it said that she was absolutely terrified. Things have been happening all night, voices and all that sort of stuff. So let me know what you think of that photo. It is on the Daily Mail's website, so if you can manage the absolutely obnoxious ads on there, then you can get a closer look at it on there. But then there's the ghost of a grey lady. And I know I just said that there's no named characters. Some people don't call her a grey lady, it's just a woman that is seen wearing a grey dress. And she seems to make an appearance a bit more often, as people say that she drifts across the grounds in a long, flowing dress, or she'll watch you from the broken windows of the building. I did come across a report from someone who said that they saw this ghostly woman walking. They were understandably terrified, so they cried out, at which point the woman turned to stare at them before vanishing in a "could you keep it down please, this is a hospital" kind of way. Oh my life, being chastised by a ghost could never be me. Let me rephrase that. Please let it never be me. Children do seem to get mentioned a lot too, with explorers claiming to hear faint laughter or seeing small childlike figures playing on the grounds. And this one, it kind of makes sense. There were children treated here, with the youngest patient recorded being a little 6-year-old girl with a learning disability. I can't say for sure without looking at full patient records, but it wouldn't be unreasonable to assume that perhaps some children passed away during outbreaks of infectious diseases that happened at Denbigh and things like that. But then we also have the classic phenomenon, the shadow figures. Sometimes people say that they're just dark shapes darting through doorways, but other times they look like figures in white coats, peering down at you from, again, the windows, or skulking about around the gardens. But if you don't see anything, you're still not safe. People exploring Denbigh have reported some really unsettling things. You'll be walking through those long, dark, dangerous corridors, and you know that you're the only one in that building, at least living, when suddenly you'll hear footsteps. Not ahead of you, not passing by, but right behind you, keeping pace. And when you stop, they do too. Sometimes doors slam, one after the other, like something is following you down that hallway too. But others swear that things get a little bit more personal and they felt a tug on their hair, or their clothes being pinched, or even a few claim to have been scratched by something inside of Denbigh. Stones get thrown across empty rooms, objects move just enough to make you question if you saw it right. But then there are the voices. People hear muffled crying, sudden bursts of manic laughter, or even whispering conversations. But they're in Welsh. Screams have also been heard too, the kind that seem to echo all over the place, coming from kind of nowhere and everywhere all at once. It's just all around you. One of the weirder reports is that a lot of people claim that their equipment malfunctions. Their cameras will start freezing up, batteries drain, and audio recorders cut out right as they pick up something weird and all of that sort of stuff. But perhaps unsurprisingly, in a place like Denbigh, one thing that crops up again and again, one common theme, is the vibe. Especially near the old isolation cells, people describe the air as getting so heavy that it's like trying to wade through soup, as though even your body knows that you shouldn't be there. And this vibe is also felt in the morgue, which is said to be one of the most active paranormal hotspots. Although, honestly, I couldn't really find anything specific, and does that really just feel a little bit cliche? Because, of course, you'd expect the morgue to be creepy, it's an obvious choice. Because Peter Glynn, the nurse who worked there back when the hospital was still open, he said that the real hotspot wasn't the morgue at all. For him, it was the kitchen. Cups would clink together and cupboard doors would swing open. It would feel like there was a patient that was trapped or in need of assistance in there, but when he'd go to check, there would be nothing out of place. But it would happen often, regularly enough for it to become a bit of a routine. But then came the night that completely cemented it all for him. Because there was a patient, an old minister, who potted out of his bedroom at about 2 a.m. He sat down for a cup of tea with Peter, talking to him about how he was a man who'd lost his faith. "Oh yes, Peter, I've lost my faith. I've lost my faith in Senecot. You know, the laxative. Wasn't having a great time of it, bless him. After they'd finished their cup of tea though and little small talk, the minister calmly announced to Peter that, right, this is my cue to leave. I need to go to the kitchen now to wrestle with the devil. And I mean, that wasn't an unusual thing for a patient to come out with, so Peter said, right you are, and he let him go. But once the minister was in the kitchen, he started hearing banging and rattling and shouting coming from the room, followed by silence. Moments later, just as he was about to make sure that the minister was okay, the older man walked back out and straightened his collar and said to the rather confused nurse, "Don't worry, I've sent him away. He won't be making any more noise." Alright, again, not unusual. Clearly he just had some stuff to work out in the kitchen. That is totally fine. And so that was that. But for the next 6 months, while Peter was working on that ward, he never heard a strange, unexplained sound come from the kitchen again. Could be a coincidence maybe, or maybe not. But nowadays, most of these reports of weirdness come from people who obviously go to explore the site. What I really want to know though is about the security guys, the ones who patrol the area night and day. Because I bet if there is something at Denbigh, they will have seen some things. There was one story I found floating about online, totally anecdotal comment, no identifying information, nothing to back it up, but someone claimed that they knew a guy who worked security at Denbigh. One night, while this guy was working, something happened to him. He never said exactly what, only that he left his shift and never went back. Apparently, he actually ended up in therapy and was never the same person again after it. But I mean, I can believe it. If it really did actually happen, imagine being alone in this massive, decaying asylum in the dead of night, and then you see something that you can't explain. No wonder the turnover for the job is supposed to be very high. But in the interests of being balanced, I do have to say that not everybody sees or hears anything. Some of the guards and contractors working on site, even to this day, have said that the creepiest thing that they've ever come across are teenagers trying to scare themselves silly. Potentially though, you won't see anything while you're there. The strangeness will come afterwards, as some people have explored the old mental hospital and didn't come across anything untoward at all. But when they got home, weird things started happening. Furniture moved with no explanation and disembodied voices were heard, speaking Welsh. Almost as if someone discharged themselves from the North Wales Mental Hospital and followed them home. While the old Denbigh Asylum is now strictly off limits to the public, that hasn't stopped these ghost stories from getting out. And with plans to turn these ruins into new homes already underway, it does leave you wondering, when the Grey Lady is seen staring from windows again, what will she think of the new neighbours? But after going through all the history and the ghost stories, I'm in a bit of an unusual place with this one, because this story really haunted me, and not in a paranormal way, because of the history, and more importantly, the people. I came across this one story of a patient who made the Christmas decorations for the ballroom every single year. After the Christmas ball, he would take them all down and immediately start on decorations for next year. That was his project, his thing. But then for someone to just come along in 2008 and decide it'd be a right laugh to torch the place. I mean, that patient was probably long gone from this world by that point, but I don't know, it just really hit differently that this wasn't just a building, this was people's lives. I have a feeling I'm going to be thinking about Denbigh for a while after this one. I do have to say though, with Peter Glynn's stories, reading through his book, they read like ghost stories. They have a little twist at the end, like they were written for an audience of a horror novel or something. So it could just be that Peter is a fantastic storyteller, which he is, relaying these experiences that he had. Because he did say that they were all true, so can't fault him for that. The guy can tell a story, but they don't read like witnesses recounting a scary experience, if that makes sense. Plus, considering his book came out in 2017 and in the description on Amazon it's listed as being perfect for fans of Most Haunted, I don't know, the very rational, skeptical side of me does keep a healthy pinch of salt at the ready. His book is fantastic though. It is short, it's only a couple of quid, really creepy, but it also gives a nice angle of what it was like to live and work there too. But then with what other explorers claimed happened to them, could some of that activity be wildlife? Apparently the developers are having a heck of a time with bats roosting, and it's a huge site that's been left for nature to reclaim for decades. So you can just imagine all of the different species that are using it as their home now. But also, obviously, you could never be 100% certain that you are the only explorer in there. Could also be down to other people sneaking in and trying to avoid you to not get caught, thinking you're the security. But at the same time that I say all of this, I do think that this place could be haunted. Over the years, thousands of people lived, worked, and died here. There was trauma, there were horrific treatments and practices, there would have been extremely high emotions at times, and that's bound to leave some energy behind. I think it will be really interesting if the development plans stay on track and people start moving into the site that once was the North Wales Mental Hospital, whether any of them start to notice anything weird about their new home. Although we do have a bit of a wait, phase 1 is due to be complete in something like 12 years time. But now I want to hear from you. Do you believe that Denbigh could really be haunted? Or is it just the atmosphere and the stories keeping it alive? And if you've got a connection to this place, whether you worked there, trained there, visited family there, or were even admitted there yourself, and you experienced anything, I would love to hear your stories. But if you enjoyed this video, please do let me know by swiping across on the comments box and hitting the hype button, as well as the like button if you're feeling generous. And if you want to support me, the best way you can do so for free is by making sure that you're subscribed. But anyway, that is all from me today. Go get yourself a drink of water. Keep yourself hydrated, please. I cannot wait to chat with you more about the morbid, mysterious and macabre, because the next story that I have to bring you is going to be kind of related to this one, but not really. Geographically related. There is another extremely haunted location very close to Denbigh Mental Hospital, which does not get talked about enough. Seems people drive straight past it to nose at the asylum, but the stories, wild. What's even better, you don't have to trespass to gain access to it, and you still get a reasonably good view of the old hospital, so there's that. Because like I said, I just want to make it clear, you can't get to Denbigh Asylum anymore, and you shouldn't really try. It's dangerous, and there are loads of security that will just kick you out anyway. When we were in London last year, a guy at the bar on the pier told us about Elwyn, the guy who used to patrol Denbigh with his vicious dog. And Elwyn has actually passed away now, but the site is still locked down tight and they still do have dogs. So yeah, if you're curious, stick to the YouTube videos. There are loads out there. But anyway, I'm rambling. I'll see you for the next one. I'm very excited about it. So until next time, sleep safe. I was so nervous that this recording was going to get disturbed because right next door, who is attached to our house, they're having new rendering put on right now. So our entire house is vibrating, but I think I got away with it. Hopefully I got away with it. We'll find out.